Good evening. A very good evening. I'm a little bit moved and very grateful for this evening. I think it's a privilege and an honor. And I want to tell you the first and most important thing in my life is living in Jerusalem. And a great man like David Ben-Gurion, who declared the state here. Thank the Almighty. For 52 years, I have been going to the library, talking to the various directors of the library. And I would say to each one, we need a national library. There was hell to pay. They said, you don't belong here. We're being paid by the university. You're going to wreck things. I said, no, we need a national library. And 3 years ago, it came to light, and today we have a national library. I want to thank the directors of the library. I think they've done a great job, and I think the real job is coming in the future even more. The Gorodetzky collection has been divided into many things, and it's in about 13 or 14 different institutions. The Haaliya Foundation had the first opening. They had shows once every few months at the University of Pennsylvania. The library in Philadelphia did a miniature show of my miniature books. And I thought that was heaven. That was the biggest thing that ever happened to me. I was then about 22 or 23 years old. The Connecticut Historical Society received the uniform of Rebecca Gertrude Afreshiner from World War I when she served with the Jewish Welfare Board. The National Library here didn't receive very much. They only got 900 items. And they said to me, bring in and we'll pick out what we want. I brought in 30. They wanted the 30. The following week I came in with 50. They wanted the 50. And the next week 50. And they told me in the beginning, they said, Ezra, there'll be no show and there'll be no catalog. A year later, there was a show and there was a catalog. And there has been 3 shows so far of the Gorodetzky collection. The Gorodetzky collection is a miniature books, children's ABCs, Aleph Bet, Hanukkah Bayit Shel Bet Knesset, dedication books of synagogues, unusual signatures, things I've taken out of book bindings. I've opened up 2,000 book bindings, and I've had about 200 major finds. Whatever I could keep came to the National Library. I think it's a great institution. I'm getting a little choked up, and I want to say thank you. Aviyad, where are you? Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, getting an honor is of the past. It's something behind me. I have to do something for the future. If the Almighty gives me the time, within the next few months or the next 100 days before Rosh Hashanah, there'll be another gift. Not quite the same, but it'll be interesting. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming tonight. Shalom and Todah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Dear colleagues and friends, I promised you before a lecture. You know, as they say in English, some people have to sing for their supper. Apparently, other people have to listen to the song. So we have both sides. It is my honor and privilege to introduce you to Professor Moshe Rosman. Actually, you could have read his biography in the booklet of the conference. I'm not going to test you now. Professor Rosman is a professor of history at there's a Polish name, Koschitzky Department of Jewish History at Ilan University. He specializes in history of Jews in Eastern Europe, more specifically Poland, and even more specifically Hasidism. And in the area of Hasidism, quite recently, a very important and interesting book by him appeared on a biography of the Baal Shem Tov, both in Hebrew and in English. So I invite Professor Rosman to talk to us about keeping the culture.
Thank you, Chagai. Erev Tov. Good evening, everyone. Like most of the basic concepts in our life, the definition of culture is contested. There are many, many definitions. No one has been able to agree on what culture is. However, listening this morning to the description of the processes going on now in library collecting and library collections, it seems to me that there is an underlying process going on, and that is a shift from one basic notion of culture to another one. Let's call it the old notion of culture, is that culture is produced by knowledge. Culture is what knowledge results in. And if that's the case, the quantity of knowledge gives us the quantity of culture. So if we have a lot of knowledge, we're going to have a lot of culture. But also, the quality is important. The denser the knowledge is, the more sophisticated the knowledge is, the more specialized, it's going to result in a better culture. So this means that knowledge culture is best when it's high culture, when it's elite culture, when it's culture that we think of as the culture of the muses: literature, art, music, dance, theater, scholarship, science. That's real culture, because that's culture that uses the most knowledge and the most sophisticated knowledge. That culture is rationed by an economy of knowledge and skill. Those who have the time, the money, the opportunity to accumulate knowledge and skills, they're the ones that are going to accumulate the most of this elite culture, and they are the elite. This kind of culture, this knowledge culture, is housed in buildings that remind us of temples and palaces. Temples and palaces are buildings with restricted access. There are very tight regulations as to who gets to go into this kind of building. What you see here is the Art Institute of Chicago, my hometown, the Opera in Paris, and the Bolshoi Ballet. So not just anybody can get in. And these kinds of quasi-palaces and temples have a monumental architecture. Oops. You have La Scala, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and the Louvre. This architecture is intended to induce a feeling of respect, decorum, even intimidation in the occasional guest who is allowed into these institutions. And to the people who belong there, the habitués, the real inhabitants, it gives them a feeling of pride, a feeling of power, a feeling of belonging, of being important. The culture that is analyzed, studied, displayed in these institutions is a culture that creates a vocabulary, a grammar, that leads to articulating values, collective identity, which are then expressed in a kind of secular creed, which replaces religion. If we take the Jewish case, for the last 250 years or so, there's been a search for Jewish culture, something unreligious, but still distinctly Jewish. Something that will allow us to have a culture that's not dependent on a religious tradition. And so this culture has produced institutions. The concert hall, replacing the synagogue. The lecture hall, replacing the yeshiva. The coffee house table, replacing the Shabbat table. And you can go on and on. With knowledge culture, there often comes a kind of class struggle. That is, the guardians of culture, the elite, feel that it must be protected. And in fact, palaces and temples are also protective buildings, protected against the Philistines, the anti-intellectuals, the people who do not understand what art and literature and music and science and scholarship, for that matter, are all about. Or to put it in terms of Pierre Bourdieu, those with high cultural capital, lots of knowledge, lots of skill, against those with low cultural capital. Now let's talk about libraries. Libraries are also institutions of knowledge culture. That is, again, culture that is the product of knowledge. And basically, they are repositories of the sacred texts of that culture. The sacred texts that are kept in what are really sacred spaces, where they are supposed to be studied and mastered under the supervision of what are cultural priests. So what does a culture or a knowledge culture library look like? As we would expect, it looks like a temple. This is the British Museum, which until the 1990s housed the British Library. And it was manned by a Praetorian Guard, which would put any Prussian military unit to shame. It also had a light problem. In 1929, when Alfred Hitchcock made the movie Blackmail that was set in the British Museum, he couldn't do it in the museum because there wasn't enough light. He had to take pictures of the museum and do it in a studio. Or let's look at this library, built in 1931 by the architect James Rogers. It is the Sterling Library of Yale University, which Rogers explicitly intended to be a secular cathedral. And it too has what we like to call in America light issues. Or the 1895 Boston Public Library, another temple-like structure. I think that the defining characteristic of knowledge culture libraries is symbolized by this. This is the delivery room of the Boston Public Library, without question a magnificent room. However, once upon a time, now of course things are different, in order to get a book, you had to submit a written request, sit in the chairs and wait until the book was delivered to you. In a knowledge culture library, we keep careful control over our books. We know where they are at all times. We make sure that the people move around as little as possible and stay in very restricted areas of the library. In knowledge culture libraries, the stacks are built to be closed. And the only people who are in them are people like this gentleman, someone whom we have all met, of course with a different name and a different face, but in the various libraries we frequent. And even today, there are still knowledge culture libraries. This I took off the website of a major European library. Admission to library reading rooms requires a reader pass. These are issued at the discretion of the library board and are subject to the conditions of use detailed herein. Anyone can apply for a reader pass to use our reading rooms, but due to pressure on our services, we cannot guarantee admission. A reader pass is issued subject to your need to see specific items in our collections. Now, let's think about this for a moment. Issued at the discretion of the library board. That is, the elite controls the institution. Other people are guests. And who gets preference for admission to this institution? People who already know what it is they want to read about. People who already are initiated into the elite culture. People who know what their needs, intellectually speaking, are. Anyone else? Well, we'll see. And then we have, of course, gatekeeping in Jerusalem at what, for the moment, I will call the JNUL, as opposed to the NLI. In 1910, after the Yosef Chazanovich collection had been completely transferred from Poland to Jerusalem as the nucleus of the library, a report was written which said, now the library has changed from being a reading room to being a research academy. Note the windows. This library seems to have been built to let in as little light as possible. Why? Because this library, as I can testify since I've been coming to it since 1972, is a scholar's haven. It belongs to us. It's the equivalent of a British gentleman's club for Israeli scholars, especially those in Jewish studies. And Chazanovich himself, when contemplating what the library would look like in Jerusalem, which was to house his books, wrote in 1899, and this is engraved in stone outside the reading rooms on the second floor of the library. In Jerusalem, our holy city, shall be built a great house, high and exalted. All of the fruits of the spirit of Israel, from the day it became a people, shall be kept there. And to this house will stream our rabbis, sages, and all the enlightened of our nation. So, as I said, it was to be a haven for professional scholars, for people who are bearers of the elite culture, and so it was for many years. Through the 20th century, a different notion of culture developed, different from the idea of knowledge culture, different from the idea that knowledge produces culture. And this started with Max Weber, who talked about the idea of Verstehen. That is, you arrive at culture through an empathic, subjective understanding of social phenomena. Let's take the example of breaking the glass at a Jewish wedding. In different contexts, in different times, to different people, this act had different significance. Once upon a time, people broke a glass to keep the demons away. Through most of the Middle Ages and beyond, people broke the glass to show that their individual act of getting married and establishing a household was to be seen within the context of a national existence, contributing to the greater good of the Jewish people in light of all the suffering they had endured, symbolized by the destruction of the temple. In more recent times, this has become one of the absolute symbols of Jewish marriage, so that in the dual faith ceremonies that have become popular recently, one thing that is virtually always present from the Jewish side is breaking the glass. Well, this is Verstehen. Let's understand these social acts, what they mean. These are the building blocks of culture. Talcott Parsons took it a step further. He said that culture is the practices and objects that communicate our ideas, our feelings, our values. Culture is collective symbolic discourse. And that, of course, has become the key word, discourse. The most common formulation of this idea is that of Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, who said, man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. If you can forgive the chauvinism for a moment, the spinning here is done by cultural discourse. And what is important as cultural manifestations are particularly those things that are unconscious, the things that we take for granted, the things that we do unthinkingly, the things that we do like breathing. So what forms our culture are things like gender roles, kinship relationships, economic practices, things that some people even feel are biologically determined, which they are not. That's the real culture. Contrast this to knowledge culture. Knowledge culture says that the important manifestations of culture are the things that are created or manufactured. Shakespeare's plays, Picasso's pictures, Mendelssohn's music, Einstein's theory. That's culture, for knowledge culture. For knowledge culture, the thing that is important is the thing that is created. For discourse culture, what is important is what is. Geertz also said that culture is expressed in what we might call social texts. His most famous article is the analysis of the cockfight in Bali, which he reads as one might read Talmud, and analyzes what the cultural significance is, what the meaning was of the various elements of the cockfight. So culture is expressed not just in written texts. Anything can be a text. a cultural text, whether it's an archaeological find or a crime or a sports game or eating at the table as a family. Any of these social acts can be read as a cultural text. And interpreting this text, getting to what he called the deep structure of the text, is what then allows us to understand what culture is, which in this idea, culture is how people construct meaning, how they make sense of the world around them. So, libraries of collective discourse culture are somewhat different from libraries of knowledge culture. Libraries of collective discourse culture are a repository of texts and texts. As we heard this morning, text without the quotation marks is no longer king. Now we worry a lot more about the texts with quotation marks. The library itself is to be the locus of the discourse, and the texts, with or without the quotation marks, are to be the focus of the discourse. And instead of cultural priests, we have cultural facilitators to facilitate discourse, not to master text. Knowledge culture libraries were very quiet places. Collective discourse culture libraries tend to be noisy, or at least to have some very noisy locations within the library. What do I mean? Here we have something from the website of the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen. The Royal Library is much more than a library. It is a cultural institution that unites the function of a library with a whole range of different cultural facilities: a cafe, bookshop, exhibition room, restaurants, scientific and literary institutions, roof terrace, and a 600-seat hall for concerts, theatrical performances, and conferences. Now, what is a library that is more than a library? If it's not a library, say so. What I think they're saying is, this is not a knowledge culture library. This is a collective discourse culture library. This is a library where we will be exploring culture through discourse, and it will be noisy. Now, what does a CDC library look like? Well, we saw the knowledge culture libraries, the palaces, the temples. Here's a CDC. It's not a palace, it's not a temple, it's a coliseum. This is the public library in Vancouver, British Columbia. A coliseum. That's a place for everybody. That's a place for popular events. That's a place where anybody can get in as long as they pay for their ticket. Or the philology library at the Free University of Berlin. Is it a covered swimming pool? Is it an indoor tennis court? Well, no, it's a library, believe me. There it is. And notice, no gatekeeping. The people and the books are next to each other. You don't have to fill out any slips. You don't even have to put anything in the computer. You just get up and take the book off the shelf. Do whatever you want with it. Walk around the library with it. Nobody's going to know what you did with it. And this is what I call bringing culture down to earth. This is the library of Delft University in Holland. And inside, this is what it looks like. It is the non-temple. It is the opposite of a temple, of a sacred place. I would say this is library as bookstore. This is a library that wants patrons to come in as much as possible, walk around, feel comfortable. Now let's talk about Judaica libraries. I would posit that Judaica libraries today are in the process of moving from knowledge culture libraries to collective discourse culture libraries. And how are they doing that? Libraries are self-conscious about keeping culture. They see themselves as culture keepers. Now that's also always been the case, but mostly in the sense of keeping as preserving. Keeping the culture, preserving the culture. I think more and more libraries today are seeing themselves as keeping culture as one might keep the commandments. That is, practice the culture, exercise the culture, cultivate the culture. Don't just be a repository, be a player, be a promoter of the culture. All of the great Judaica libraries, like most great libraries, started on the basis of some big collection, like the Chazanovich collection for the JNUL. That meant that the library was shaped basically by availability. The collection was shaped according to what was available. Today, things are different. In 2007, the Knesset passed a national library law. There are corporate regulations of the new Israel National Library. There are specific objectives. There are policies. Libraries today are being shaped through intention, not by availability. And the libraries themselves are defining knowledge differently. They are going from knowledge culture, where knowledge was considered what is in the books, where knowledge was considered what the authors of the books were trying to tell us, to discourse culture, where books are considered as one element in a much larger system of discourse, and where the culture the book reflects is not only the ideas that were written in it, but rather the book reflects just as much, and perhaps even more so, the people who use it. And I say use, not only read. Read is only one use that these books are put to. So in symbolic discourse culture, the library realizes that culture is more than a book, and a book is more than the text that it's written in. The famous book scholar Roger Chartier has written, authors don't write books. Authors write texts that other people make into books. And in the space between text and book, that's where you'll find the culture. So, for example, Jewish Theological Seminary, my alma mater, in the 1930s advertised itself as the National Museum of the Jewish Book, and I would add the Jewish canonical book. That is, the Jewish people are the people of the book. Jewish culture is what is in those books. You want to understand Jewish culture, read the books. Today, the website says that there is literally not a subject of Jewish interest that you cannot study or research here, whether it's in the books or not. Jewish interest, not Jewish books. And the methods of inquiry are legion, as we heard this morning. And then, of course, our libraries are going from text to texts. Now, of course, there were always other things in the library in addition to books, but they were stepchildren, junior partners, things that were done as an afterthought. Today, the other texts, the quotation mark texts, are just as important and perhaps more important. As we heard today, and as all of us have been contemplating for a long time, we don't know what the future of books will be. There may not be books. That same National Library law that I mentioned before doesn't say anything about collecting books for the Israel National Library. So libraries have moved more and more to the quotation mark texts, and I can't help but bring the example of the Harvard Judaica Division. The Judaica Division collects in great depth, materials covering all aspects of Jewish life and culture in every place and period. These materials include books, pamphlets, periodicals, microfilms, maps, newspapers, posters, broadsides, photographs, microforms, sound recordings, videotapes, electronic databases, and other ephemera. And I'm sure we could extend the list. And then we have the question of how do our libraries view Jewish culture vis-a-vis culture? What is the metaphor of the relationship between Jewish culture and culture? Once upon a time, the relationship was seen as one of attack and defense. That is, small quantitatively, weak Jewish culture had to defend itself against the impingement of the cultures around. Jewish culture was besieged. It might have been very rich in terms of its content, but in terms of its strength to assert itself in the cultural context, it had problems. It had to be defended. It had to be protected. I would say that for a long time now, that metaphor has changed. On the right, we have a picture by Solomon J. Solomon called High Tea in the Sukkah, 1910, with Chief Rabbi Adler hosting in the Sukkah, and the ladies and gentlemen taking their high tea. You'll note that both the rabbi and the Sukkah would not have looked comfortable about 1,000 miles east of London. And the people in the Sukkah are certainly very English or British. I would say this is an example of what we might call categorically Jewish, distinctly English. Categorically Jewish, distinctly English. And this shows not cultures in conflict, but rather cultures in dialogue. Jewish culture in dialogue with English or British culture. And I would say that this is what virtually all of our libraries have adopted today. For example, the University of Pennsylvania Judaica collections say materials are collected with particular emphasis on the general contexts in which Jewish history and literature have been produced, such as in the ancient Near East, the Greco-Roman world, the Latin West and Eastern Orthodox geographies of early and medieval Christianity, the worlds of classical, medieval, and modern Islam, etc., etc. And physically, Judaica libraries are in the process of moving from temple to what we might call arcade. Let's look again at our not very light JNUL. Unfortunately, I could not get any pictures from the architectural competition for the NLI, the National Library of Israel. It's a big secret. But I did get something from the architectural brief for the new building, what the architectural contestants are supposed to take into consideration. And what does it say? Establish a consummate whole that reflects the library's vision of openness and accessibility. Create a pleasant, user-friendly space that is easy to navigate, comfortable and convenient for everyone in it, encouraging extended stays and frequent visits while providing added value to the library's resources and services, and encouraging participation in the activities that will take place there. Fulfill the diverse needs of a large communities of users and staff. Large communities? Where am I? Where are the scholars? Where's the Scholars' Haven? We don't own it anymore. It's now going to be open and accessible, user-friendly. It's for everyone, and there are going to be many activities there, not just sitting and reading books. And we want to serve large communities. So, as Ezra Gorodetzky said, finally, Israel will have a real national library. And here you have tokens of many of the libraries that you come from. I would only ask you to think, what kind of culture does your library represent? Thank you.